If you still believe your addiction is the problem, you still don't understand why it keeps returning. Most people spend years trying to kill habits that were never the real enemy in the first place. And the terrifying part is this: some addictions survive even after the substance disappears. Before we begin, if you're new here, you're probably starting to notice patterns most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And if you've been here for a while, then you already understand this channel was never about motivation. It's about seeing clearly, about building a mind that no longer collapses under comfort, impulse, and emotional manipulation. Turn on subtitles if you want to absorb this deeply. Some truths sound different when you read them slowly, because what you're about to hear is going to force you to question something you've probably said to yourself for years. I need more discipline. No, you don't. Discipline matters. But discipline alone is a temporary prison if the identity inside you still worships the same escape routes. That's why some people quit drinking and become addicted to validation. Why some people stop smoking but start destroying themselves with attention. Why some people quit pornography only to become obsessed with social media, relationships, gambling, food, or endless productivity that secretly functions the exact same way. Different behavior, same hunger. Most addictions are not chemical first. They're psychological shelters. And once you understand that, human behavior starts becoming disturbingly predictable. You can watch it happen everywhere. The man who says he's working hard, but panics whenever he's alone with his thoughts. The woman who keeps entering destructive relationships because chaos feels more familiar than peace. The person who scrolls for 6 hours straight, not because the content is interesting, but because silence forces them to confront themselves. People don't just consume substances. They consume relief. That's why the world keeps designing newer distractions every year. Faster dopamine, shorter attention spans, more stimulation, more noise. Because modern society discovered something profitable a long time ago. An emotionally unresolved person is easier to control, especially if they never realize what they're actually escaping from. And maybe this started earlier than you think. Not with alcohol, not with lust, not with weed, not with gambling, not even with social media. Maybe it started the first time you realized being yourself didn't feel safe. That's where most addictions are born. Not in pleasure. In emotional survival, a child learns very quickly what gets rewarded and what gets rejected. Some children are ignored unless they perform. Some are mocked when they express emotion. Some grow up inside homes where tension hangs in the air like invisible smoke. Some discover that achievement earns temporary love. Others learn silence prevents conflict. So they adapt. But adaptation has consequences nobody warns you about. Because eventually the performance becomes identity. And once survival behavior becomes identity, the body keeps repeating it long after the danger is gone. That's why certain people cannot sit still without reaching for stimulation. Why some people sabotage calm relationships. Why others constantly need music, notifications, noise, drama, movement, substances, validation, or chaos surrounding them at all times. Stillness feels threatening to them. Not because silence is dangerous. Because silence removes anesthesia, and underneath the distractions sits something they've spent years trying not to meet. Themselves. You can see this clearly late at night. That hour when the room becomes quiet. When the scrolling slows down. When the dopamine wears off. When nobody is texting. When there's no performance left to maintain. That's when reality starts leaking through the cracks. And most people immediately run. Some run into alcohol, some into pornography. Some into meaningless conversations, some into food, some into fantasy, some into endless ambition. But very few people are willing to sit there long enough to ask the question that changes everything. What part of me is this addiction protecting? Not feeding, protecting. That question alone separates people who endlessly relapse from people who fundamentally transform. Because the average person tries to remove behavior while protecting the identity that created it. Impossible. You cannot permanently remove a coping mechanism while emotionally remaining the same person who depended on it to survive. That's why white-knuckle discipline rarely lasts. You've probably experienced this yourself. You quit for a few days, maybe a few weeks. You feel strong at first, proud, in control. Then something happens. Stress, loneliness, rejection, boredom, emotional exhaustion, failure. Silence. And suddenly the urge returns with terrifying intensity. Not because you lack discipline. Because your nervous system still believes the addiction is medicine. That's the part people misunderstand. Your brain does not care about your future goals nearly as much as it cares about emotional familiarity. Familiar pain often feels safer than unfamiliar peace. Read that again carefully. Some people would rather destroy themselves predictably than change unpredictably. Because identity is addictive too. Even destructive identity. Especially destructive identity. The victim identity. The broken identity. The lonely identity. The hypersexual identity. The emotionally numb identity. The self-destructive identity. People cling to these identities because pain at least feels known. Transformation feels uncertain, and uncertainty terrifies the human mind more than suffering itself. That's why people return to toxic relationships they claim destroyed them. Why addicts relapse right after moments of progress. Why disciplined people suddenly sabotage themselves the moment life starts improving. Their external behavior changed faster than their internal identity could tolerate. So the subconscious drags them back toward emotional familiarity. Most people never realize they're obeying invisible emotional programming installed years earlier. They think they're choosing. Many times, they're reacting. Conditioning disguised as personality. And the modern world quietly reinforces it every day. Look around carefully. Entire industries profit from dysregulated minds. Algorithms study your loneliness. Apps study your impulses. Advertising studies your insecurity. Entertainment studies your attention span better than you do. They know exhausted people consume more. Emotionally unstable people click faster. Lonely people stay online longer. Insecure people buy identities. Distracted people don't ask difficult questions. A person who cannot regulate themselves becomes predictable. That's why reclaiming your attention is no longer just self-improvement. It's psychological independence. And most people never reach it because they misunderstand what recovery actually requires. They think recovery means resisting temptation forever. No, real transformation happens when the old temptation no longer matches who you believe yourself to be. That's different, very different. A man trying not to smoke still negotiates with cigarettes internally. A man who no longer identifies as someone needing escape experiences a completely different psychological reality. One is resisting himself. The other has changed himself. That's why identity always outperforms motivation long term. Every time. Motivation is emotional weather. Identity is infrastructure. One changes hourly. The other shapes behavior automatically. You already understand this in other areas of life without realizing it. Someone who identifies as an athlete naturally protects their body differently. Someone who identifies as disciplined manages time differently. Someone who identifies as a victim interprets every obstacle differently. Identity silently filters behavior before conscious decisions even occur. Which means your addiction is often not the disease itself. It's evidence. Evidence of an unresolved internal relationship. And this is where people become uncomfortable. Because once you see addiction this way, excuses start collapsing. You can no longer blame only the substance, or the platform, or society, or your environment. Now you must confront the architecture underneath the behavior. Why do you need escape so badly? Why does stillness feel unbearable? Why does discomfort immediately trigger consumption? Why do you panic when reality becomes emotionally quiet? Most people never answer these questions honestly because honest answers threaten identity. And identity protects itself aggressively. That's why people defend behaviors destroying them. Have you noticed that? Someone destroys their health yet becomes angry when confronted. Someone keeps choosing toxic partners yet rejects accountability. Someone complains constantly about feeling empty but resists every uncomfortable step toward change. Because beneath the conscious mind sits another fear entirely. If I lose this coping mechanism, who am I without it? That question silently terrifies millions of people. Because many addictions become woven into personality itself. The funny drunk, the emotionally unavailable man, the party girl, the workaholic, the chronic escapist, the constantly distracted person. Over time the behavior stops feeling temporary. It becomes identity theater. And people defend identity more fiercely than truth. Even when the identity is killing them slowly. Especially then. Because the longer you live inside a false identity, the more terrifying transformation becomes. Transformation feels like death before it feels like freedom. That's the hidden part nobody talks about. When you truly start changing, there's a period where your old life no longer fits, but your new identity hasn't stabilized yet either. That middle stage is brutal. You feel detached, restless, emotionally exposed, uncertain, sometimes lonely in ways words barely describe. Because your nervous system is losing familiar anesthetics while your mind is still learning how to exist without them. Most people relapse there, not because they failed, because they mistook emotional withdrawal for proof they were broken. But discomfort during transformation is not evidence you're moving incorrectly. Many times it's evidence the old identity is starving. And identities do not die quietly. They negotiate, manipulate, rationalize, delay, distract. I'll quit next month. One more time. I deserve relief. It's not that serious. Everyone does it. I can stop whenever I want. The mind becomes a lawyer defending its own imprisonment. Watch human behavior long enough and you start noticing something disturbing. People often protect the very thing destroying them because destruction feels familiar. Freedom doesn't. That's why some people unconsciously sabotage peace. Chaos gives them identity. And without identity, the ego panics. This is also why external success rarely fixes internal addiction. Someone gets money, still empty. Someone gains status, still restless. Someone becomes attractive, still emotionally dependent. Because unresolved identity simply changes costumes. The addiction evolves. Sometimes it even becomes socially praised. Work addiction, validation addiction, attention addiction, achievement addiction. Society applauds some self-destruction while condemning others. But internally the mechanism is often identical. I need this external thing to regulate how I feel about myself. That sentence controls more human behavior than people realize. And once external things control internal stability, you become emotionally owned by whatever you depend on. A person addicted to validation becomes controlled by opinion. A person addicted to pleasure becomes controlled by impulse. A person addicted to distraction becomes controlled by stimulation. This is why self-mastery is not about perfection. It's about reducing what has power over your nervous system. That's real freedom, not pretending temptation disappears, but reaching a point where your mind no longer collapses every time discomfort enters the room. Because discomfort is not the enemy. Unconsciousness is, and most people spend their entire lives unconscious to the real reason they keep returning to the same destructive cycles. Not because they're weak, because they're loyal to an identity they never consciously chose. But something shifts the moment you finally see this clearly. Because now the question changes completely. Instead of asking, how do I stop this addiction? You begin asking, who becomes unnecessary once I heal? And that question is far more dangerous. Because now you are no longer fighting behavior. You are confronting identity itself. And identity fights back hardest right before transformation begins. The strange part about identity is that most people inherit it before they ever consciously build it. You were watched before you understood yourself. Labeled before you understood your own mind. Rewarded for certain behaviors. Punished for others. And eventually you stopped asking who you really were. You started asking what version of yourself would survive socially. That's where the fracture begins. Not dramatic. Not cinematic. Quiet. So quiet most people never notice it happening. A child hides emotion because vulnerability gets mocked. A teenager learns attention feels better than invisibility. A young man discovers lust temporarily numbs loneliness. Someone drinks for the first time and suddenly feels socially acceptable. Someone scrolls endlessly because silence feels emotionally heavier than stimulation. Tiny moments, but repeated often enough, they become neurological instructions. And the dangerous thing about repeated behavior is that the brain eventually stops seeing it as behavior. It starts seeing it as you. That's why people say things like, this is just how I am. I've always been like this. My brain works differently. I can't help it. Sometimes that's true, but many times it's conditioning wearing the mask of identity. And the longer it survives unchallenged, the more sacred it becomes psychologically. Because identity creates emotional gravity. Once something becomes part of who you are, your mind begins defending it automatically. Even when it hurts you. Especially when it hurts you. That's the contradiction most people never confront. Painful identities often become emotionally addictive because they provide certainty. The angry person knows how to be angry. The lonely person knows how to be lonely. The distracted person knows how to avoid themselves. The addicted person knows where relief is located. But healing removes familiarity, and unfamiliarity creates psychological panic. That's why some people unconsciously relapse immediately after moments of clarity. Not because they didn't understand the truth. Because the truth threatened continuity. And continuity feels safer to the brain than freedom. This becomes painfully obvious once you start observing your own patterns honestly. Not the edited version you show people. Not the motivational version. Not the version built from quotes and temporary inspiration. The real one. The one nobody sees. The version of you that appears when life becomes emotionally difficult. Because stress exposes identity faster than comfort ever will. Anybody can speak about discipline when life feels stable. But watch what happens after rejection. After failure. After loneliness. After humiliation. After emotional exhaustion. After boredom. That's when identity reveals itself. A man says he wants peace, then creates chaos the moment things become calm. Someone claims they want discipline, but secretly fears the isolation discipline requires. Someone says they want freedom, while remaining emotionally dependent on distractions every single day. People often desire outcomes that conflict with the identity they secretly protect. That internal contradiction creates suffering, and suffering without awareness becomes cycles. That's why some people repeat the same year emotionally for 10 years straight. Different faces, different environments, different habits, same nervous system, same emotional reactions, same escapes, because environments change faster than identities do. You can move cities and still carry the same emotional patterns. You can enter relationships and still remain emotionally avoidant. You can delete apps while remaining addicted to stimulation internally. External changes alone rarely free people. Internal architecture matters more, and most people never rebuild it because rebuilding identity is deeply uncomfortable. It requires grief. Not grief for another person. Grief for versions of yourself you survived through. That's the hidden emotional layer nobody talks about in self-improvement culture. People say, just let go. Move on. Be disciplined. But they ignore something crucial. Some identities were built to protect you during painful periods of life. Which means part of you became emotionally attached to the coping mechanism because at one point, it worked. The drinking worked. The emotional numbness worked. The avoidance worked. The pornography worked. The overthinking worked. The constant joking worked. The isolation worked. It protected you from something. Maybe rejection. Maybe shame. Maybe fear. Maybe abandonment. Maybe inadequacy. Maybe emptiness. That's why healing cannot happen through self-hatred alone. You cannot permanently transform by treating yourself like an enemy. Because the addicted part of you is usually not evil. It's frightened. Frightened of losing the only emotional survival strategy it trusts. And once you see that clearly, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, what pain trained me to become this? That question changes everything. Because now you're observing yourself instead of blindly obeying yourself. That's awareness. And awareness interrupts automatic behavior. Not instantly, not perfectly, but consistently. For the first time, you begin noticing urges instead of becoming them. That distinction matters. Most people merge completely with impulse. They feel boredom and instantly consume stimulation. They feel anxiety and instantly seek escape. They feel loneliness and instantly search for distraction. There's no space between emotion and reaction. Just programming. But transformation begins the moment space appears. A pause. Small at first, almost invisible, but powerful. Because within that pause sits choice. And choice is where identity starts changing. Not through grand declarations. Not through dramatic motivation. Not through pretending temptation vanished. Through repeated moments where you interrupt unconscious patterns before they complete themselves. That's how identities actually change. Quietly. Repetition built the old self. Repetition builds the new one. But this is where most people fail. Because they expect identity transformation to feel empowering immediately. Usually it feels empty first. Even boring. Because your nervous system was conditioned for intensity. High dopamine. High stimulation. High emotional fluctuation. And when you remove constant stimulation, normal life initially feels emotionally flat. People mistake this for failure all the time. Someone quits destructive habits and suddenly life feels dull. The music doesn't hit the same. The excitement decreases. The emotional highs disappear. And they panic. What's wrong with me? Nothing. Your nervous system is recalibrating. But modern culture never explains this. Instead, it teaches people to chase constant emotional intensity as if peace is supposed to feel exciting all the time. It isn't. Peace is quieter than addiction. That's why emotionally chaotic people often mistake peace for emptiness initially. Their body became so adapted to overstimulation that calmness feels emotionally unfamiliar. And unfamiliar emotions create withdrawal. This is why many people secretly return to destructive behavior even when life improves. They miss the intensity, the chaos, the unpredictability, the emotional spikes, because addiction is not always about pleasure. Sometimes it's about emotional contrast, feeling something stronger than numbness. And that realization changes how you see society entirely. Look around carefully. Everything competes for your nervous system now. Notifications, videos, arguments, news, lust, outrage, validation, comparison. Modern life profits from emotional instability. A calm mind consumes less impulsively. That's dangerous for industries built on attention. So people remain overstimulated constantly. And overstimulation weakens self-awareness. An overstimulated mind loses sensitivity. Simple things stop feeling meaningful. Stillness becomes unbearable. Patience weakens. Focus collapses. Then people wonder why discipline feels impossible. You cannot build internal clarity while drowning in constant psychological noise. And the noise is deliberate. Not always malicious, but deliberate. Because a distracted person rarely questions themselves deeply. That's why silence becomes powerful. Not trendy silence. Not aesthetic isolation. Real silence. The uncomfortable kind. The kind where there's no entertainment protecting you from your own mind. Most people avoid that silence their entire lives. Because silence reveals dependence brutally. You discover how addicted you are to stimulation. How emotionally restless you've become. How difficult it feels to simply exist without consumption. And once you notice that, you can never fully unsee it again. That's the beginning of self-awareness. Not becoming superior. Becoming honest. There's a difference. Real awareness humbles people, because you begin realizing how much of your behavior was automatic. How many desires were conditioned. How many habits were emotional reflexes. How many decisions were attempts to regulate internal discomfort. You start seeing that addiction is often emotional outsourcing. You hand your emotional regulation to substances, people, platforms, routines, fantasies, attention, or stimulation because internally you never learned how to sit with yourself safely. And that's where the deeper transformation starts. Not when temptation disappears. When your relationship with discomfort changes. Most people panic at discomfort immediately. But emotionally mature people understand something others don't. Discomfort carries information. Loneliness reveals dependency. Boredom reveals overstimulation. Impulsiveness reveals emotional avoidance. Constant distraction reveals internal unrest. Your symptoms are communicating, but addiction interrupts the message before understanding can happen. That's why healing requires staying present long enough to hear what your mind has been trying to tell you beneath the noise. And sometimes what you hear is painful. You realize you've been lonely for years. Emotionally disconnected, fearful, ashamed, avoidant, chronically seeking approval, terrified of inadequacy, afraid nobody would value the real version of you without performance attached. These realizations hurt, but hidden pain controls people more aggressively than acknowledged pain. What remains unconscious controls behavior from the shadows. That's why awareness feels uncomfortable before it feels freeing. You start seeing patterns everywhere. You notice how certain environments trigger old versions of yourself. How certain people reinforce destructive identities. How certain songs, routines, conversations, and emotional states reopen familiar pathways automatically. And slowly you realize something disturbing. Many people around you are also protecting identities they secretly suffer inside. The man obsessed with status. The person addicted to attention online. The friend who cannot tolerate silence. The constant entertainer. The emotionally unavailable partner. The perpetual victim. Human beings become experts at normalizing dysfunction collectively. If enough people suffer the same way, society starts calling it normal. But normal does not mean healthy. And once you begin rebuilding your identity consciously, you start feeling emotionally disconnected from certain environments naturally. Not because you think you're better than others. Because your nervous system no longer wants what it used to crave. That's transformation, not forced superiority, changed appetite. A disciplined person doesn't constantly negotiate with every impulse because their identity changed around what they value emotionally. That's the destination most people misunderstand. Freedom is not constant resistance. It's reduced internal conflict. Imagine no longer spending every day mentally wrestling with the same urges. Imagine silence no longer terrifying you. Imagine boredom no longer feeling dangerous. Imagine being emotionally stable without needing endless stimulation just to tolerate existence. That's power. Quiet power. And the people who develop it stop appearing desperate. Because desperation always comes from dependency. Dependency on validation. Dependency on distraction. Dependency on pleasure. Dependency on emotional escape. Once dependency weakens, your entire presence changes. You become calmer, more observant, less reactive, harder to manipulate, harder to provoke, harder to emotionally control. That's why self-mastery threatens systems built on impulsiveness. A person who governs themselves becomes difficult to influence externally. And that's rare now. Very rare. Most people are externally programmed and internally fragmented. They consume endlessly but rarely reflect. They react constantly but rarely observe. They chase relief but avoid understanding. Then they wonder why nothing changes long term. Because behavior modification without identity reconstruction eventually collapses under emotional pressure. Always. The old self returns the moment stress arrives. Unless something deeper changes. And that deeper change begins with a difficult realization most people spend years avoiding. You are not fighting an addiction. You are grieving a former version of yourself that no longer deserves control over your future. And grief changes the entire process. Because now you stop romanticizing the old coping mechanisms. You stop worshiping your own suffering. You stop identifying with your wounds so aggressively. For the first time, you begin separating survival from identity. And once that separation begins, the old version of you starts losing authority. Quietly, but permanently. There comes a moment during real transformation where your old behaviors stop feeling satisfying, but your new life still doesn't feel natural yet. That stage confuses almost everyone. Because nobody prepares you for the psychological emptiness that appears after you stop escaping yourself. You think removing the addiction will instantly create peace. Instead, you often meet silence first. A strange silence. Not external silence. Internal silence. The emotional static starts fading. The constant stimulation decreases. The dopamine spikes weaken. And suddenly you're left alone with thoughts that were buried for years beneath noise and consumption. That's when many people relapse. Not because they truly wanted the addiction back. Because they weren't prepared for what existed underneath it. The loneliness. The insecurity. The unresolved grief. The emotional exhaustion. The identity confusion. For years the addiction acted like psychological insulation. Now the insulation is gone. And reality feels colder than expected. This is where weak advice destroys people. Because shallow self-improvement culture tells you to just stay strong, without explaining what strength actually looks like psychologically. Real strength is not pretending urges don't exist. Real strength is remaining conscious while your nervous system begs for familiar escape. That's different. Very different. Because the hardest part of transformation is not removing pleasure. It's tolerating emotional exposure without running back to anesthesia. Most people have never actually learned how to sit with themselves honestly. They know how to distract themselves, entertain themselves, stimulate themselves, numb themselves, but sitting still with unresolved emotion, that feels unbearable, so they return to familiar cycles because at least those cycles provide structure. Predictable suffering becomes emotionally comforting after enough repetition. That's why some people sabotage progress right before their life improves. You've probably done this before without fully understanding why. You start becoming disciplined, focused, consistent. Then suddenly you binge old habits again. Disappear emotionally. Waste time. Destroy momentum. Return to distractions you already knew were damaging. And afterward you feel confused. Why would someone sabotage something good? Because improvement threatens old identity structures. A person who secretly believes they are broken will eventually feel uncomfortable succeeding. A person addicted to chaos will unconsciously recreate instability. A person emotionally attached to suffering may reject peace without realizing it. A person conditioned by rejection may distrust healthy love automatically. People don't just repeat behaviors. They repeat emotional environments. That's why unresolved identity keeps recreating familiar pain in different forms. The faces change. The habits change. The circumstances change. But the emotional pattern survives underneath everything. And once you start noticing this, human behavior becomes painfully transparent. You realize how many people are not pursuing happiness at all. They're pursuing emotional familiarity. That's why emotionally unavailable people attract emotionally unavailable partners. Why anxious minds seek chaotic environments. Why addicted minds seek overstimulation. Why insecure people become dependent on external validation. People gravitate toward emotional realities that confirm existing identity, even when those realities hurt them. Especially then, because identity always seeks evidence to reinforce itself. A person who sees themselves as unwanted notices rejection more intensely. A person who sees themselves as inadequate becomes hypersensitive to criticism. A person who identifies as weak interprets discomfort as proof of failure. The mind constantly gathers evidence supporting its existing narrative, which means if your identity remains damaged, your perception becomes distorted too. That's dangerous, because eventually you stop seeing reality clearly. You start seeing life through the filter of your wounds. And wounded perception creates wounded decisions. That's why healing is not just emotional. It's perceptual. Your entire interpretation of life changes when identity changes. The disciplined person sees boredom differently. The emotionally secure person sees rejection differently. The self-aware person sees discomfort differently. Same events, different internal architecture. That's why two people can experience identical circumstances and respond in completely opposite ways. One collapses, one adapts, one escapes, one observes, one reacts emotionally, one remains conscious. Identity determines interpretation long before behavior occurs. And this becomes terrifying once you realize most people never consciously choose their identity at all. They inherit it accidentally through repetition, environment, fear, trauma, social conditioning, and emotional survival. Then they spend decades defending it as personality. But personality can become prison, especially when suffering becomes familiar enough to feel authentic. Look carefully at modern culture. People are encouraged to build identities around dysfunction constantly. My anxiety, my depression, my trauma, my toxic trait, my avoidant personality. Now understand this clearly. Pain is real, trauma is real, mental suffering is real, but there's a dangerous line between acknowledging pain and building your entire identity around it. Because once suffering becomes identity, healing starts feeling like self-erasure. And many people unconsciously resist healing because they no longer know who they are without the struggle. That's why some people endlessly talk about change while remaining emotionally committed to the same cycles. The suffering became familiar, socially reinforced, even comforting. Misery can become community now. Victimhood can become identity currency. Public dysfunction can become attention. And attention rewards repetition. So people unconsciously keep performing the same wounds. Not always intentionally, but predictably. This is why emotional discipline matters far beyond addiction itself. Without emotional discipline, identity gets shaped by every external force around you. Algorithms shape desire. Social trends shape self-worth. Attention shapes behavior. Validation shapes personality. And eventually people lose contact with themselves entirely. They become reactive creatures, emotionally programmable. That's why reclaiming your mind is one of the most rebellious things a person can do now. Because modern life trains people to avoid internal depth completely. Everything moves fast. Everything distracts. Everything stimulates. Everything demands attention immediately. Stillness became uncomfortable because people lost familiarity with their own minds. Notice how difficult it is now for most people to sit alone without reaching for a screen within minutes. That's not accidental. That's conditioning. An overstimulated nervous system becomes dependent on interruption. And dependency weakens sovereignty. A person unable to tolerate stillness becomes emotionally controllable by anything offering relief. That's why the strongest people are often the calmest. Not because they feel less emotion, Because they are no longer enslaved by every emotion they feel. There's a difference. Weak minds obey impulses immediately. Strong minds observe impulses before deciding. That pause changes lives. And the terrifying part is that most people never develop it. They spend their entire existence reacting unconsciously. Feeling, consuming, escaping, repeating. Years disappear that way. Then one day they wake up older, emotionally exhausted, and confused why nothing internal truly changed despite all the external movement. Because movement is not transformation. Busyness is not healing. Achievement is not peace. Pleasure is not freedom. And distraction is not fulfillment. The world confuses these things constantly. Someone becomes successful yet still emotionally dependent. Someone becomes attractive yet still deeply insecure. Someone gains status yet still cannot sit alone peacefully. Because unresolved identity survives external upgrades. That's why some rich people still self-destruct. Some famous people still collapse psychologically. Some admired people still secretly hate themselves. External success cannot stabilize internal fragmentation. Only awareness can begin doing that. And awareness requires honesty most people avoid. Brutal honesty. Not performative self-awareness. Not intellectual understanding. Not quoting philosophy online while secretly remaining controlled by impulse. Real honesty. The kind that forces you to admit, I use distractions to avoid myself. I chase validation because internally I feel insufficient. I keep overstimulating my mind because silence exposes unresolved pain. I built entire behaviors around emotional survival. That level of honesty changes people permanently. Because once truth becomes conscious, unconscious patterns lose some of their power. Not instantly, but significantly. You begin catching yourself earlier. You notice emotional triggers before they fully control behavior. You notice the urge forming before reacting automatically. You notice the internal dialogue trying to justify self-destruction. And slowly something remarkable starts happening. The observer inside you becomes stronger than the impulse itself. That's when identity reconstruction truly begins. Not when temptation disappears. When awareness becomes stronger than unconscious programming. This is why journaling changes some people profoundly. Why solitude transforms certain individuals. Why meditation feels unbearable initially but powerful later. Why silence eventually becomes comforting instead of threatening. These practices strengthen observation. And observation weakens automaticity. A conscious mind interrupts destructive momentum faster. That's why emotionally reactive people avoid self-reflection so aggressively. Because reflection exposes patterns. And exposed patterns demand responsibility. Most people would rather maintain distraction than confront the painful realization that many of their habits were self-created prisons. Even if those prisons were originally built from pain. But responsibility changes everything. Not guilt. Responsibility. Guilt traps people in shame. Responsibility creates movement. A guilty person says, I'm terrible. A responsible person says, I see the pattern clearly now. Those are completely different psychological states. One collapses identity further. The other rebuilds it consciously. And rebuilding identity requires repetition so small it almost feels meaningless at first. That's another reason people fail. They underestimate the power of tiny consistent behaviors. One conscious decision, one interrupted impulse, one honest moment, one evening spent without escape, one difficult conversation, one uncomfortable silence endured instead of avoided. These moments appear insignificant individually. But identities are not built dramatically. They are built through repetition. Quiet repetition. The same way water shapes stone slowly over time. And eventually something shifts internally. You stop craving certain things with the same desperation. You stop romanticizing chaos. You stop glorifying self-destruction. You stop needing constant stimulation just to feel emotionally stable. The nervous system begins healing. And healing changes perception. Things that once controlled you start looking smaller, more obvious, less powerful. Not because temptation vanished, because you changed your relationship with it. That's freedom. Not becoming emotionless. Becoming conscious enough that emotions no longer govern your entire existence automatically. And once people experience even a glimpse of that state, they start seeing the world differently forever. They notice how reactive society has become. How emotionally manipulated people are. How desperate modern culture feels beneath the surface. Everyone consuming. Everyone chasing. Everyone distracting themselves from something. Very few stopping long enough to ask, who would I become if I no longer needed escape? That question terrifies people because deep down they sense the answer would require killing parts of themselves emotionally. And they're right. Transformation is not adding a new personality on top of the old one. It's allowing outdated identities to die. Painfully sometimes, quietly often, but necessarily. Because eventually you realize something impossible to ignore. The addiction was never the deepest problem. The dependency was. And dependency always reveals where freedom is missing internally. Most people never notice the exact moment dependency begins controlling their life. Because dependency rarely arrives looking dangerous. It arrives looking comforting, helpful, pleasurable, temporary, a small escape after stress, a distraction after loneliness, a reward after exhaustion. Nothing dramatic. That's why dangerous habits often enter quietly. They don't announce destruction immediately. They introduce relief first. And relief is powerful when someone has spent years emotionally overwhelmed without understanding why. That's the hidden vulnerability modern life exploits constantly. People are exhausted internally, mentally overstimulated, emotionally disconnected, chronically distracted, quietly anxious. So anything offering fast relief becomes seductive. Not because people are weak. Because exhausted minds seek regulation wherever they can find it. That's why addiction often grows strongest during periods of emotional instability. After heartbreak, after failure, after humiliation, after isolation, after identity collapse, pain creates openings, and whatever enters during those openings can become psychologically attached to survival itself. That's why some people defend destructive behaviors so aggressively. To them, the behavior doesn't feel optional emotionally. It feels protective. Take away the coping mechanism too quickly and unresolved emotion floods back in all at once. That's why people relapse hardest when life becomes emotionally heavy. The nervous system remembers where relief used to exist, even if the relief eventually became poison. That's the contradiction of addiction. The same thing that slowly destroys you also temporarily comforts you. And human beings become deeply attached to whatever reduces pain quickly, even when the long-term cost is devastating. This pattern exists far beyond substances. Look carefully at relationships. Some people don't love each other. They regulate each other. One provides validation. One provides emotional intensity. One provides distraction from loneliness. One provides temporary escape from self-worth issues. The relationship becomes addiction disguised as connection. That's why some people cannot leave toxic dynamics even when suffering becomes obvious. Their nervous system became chemically attached to emotional unpredictability. Chaos started feeling intimate. Calm started feeling suspicious. And once that happens, peace feels emotionally unfamiliar. That's why emotionally healthy relationships initially feel boring to some damaged people. Not because peace lacks depth. Because their nervous system became conditioned for instability. You can apply this same pattern to almost everything. People become addicted to outrage, to attention, to being desired, to being needed, to victimhood, to status, to productivity, to stimulation, to emotional intensity itself. And society rewards many of these addictions openly because profitable addictions are often normalized. An overworked person gets praised. An overstimulated person looks productive. A validation-addicted person appears socially active. An emotionally unavailable person appears strong. Meanwhile, internally they remain fragmented. That's why appearances deceive people constantly. Some of the most disciplined-looking individuals are secretly driven by fear. Some of the loudest people are deeply insecure. Some of the most admired people cannot tolerate being alone with themselves for 10 minutes. External image reveals very little about internal sovereignty. And sovereignty is the real goal, not perfection. Sovereignty means your mind no longer gets hijacked by every impulse, insecurity, craving, emotion, or external influence surrounding you. That level of internal stability is becoming increasingly rare. Because modern systems benefit from fragmented attention and unstable identity. Think carefully about how often people are encouraged to define themselves externally now. Followers, likes, status, sexual attention, money, aesthetic image, social approval. Entire identities are being constructed from external feedback loops, which means millions of people no longer know who they are privately. Only publicly. And when identity depends on external reinforcement, emotional dependency becomes inevitable. That's why criticism destroys some people emotionally. Why rejection destabilizes them. Why silence feels unbearable. Why loneliness feels catastrophic. Their internal identity lacks independent structure. Everything depends on external response. That's dangerous, because emotionally dependent people become easily manipulated. If praise controls you, criticism controls you too. If attention controls you, isolation controls you too. If pleasure controls you, discomfort controls you too. Whatever governs your emotional state governs your behavior eventually. This is why disciplined people appear calmer under pressure. Not because they feel nothing. Because they trained themselves not to obey every internal reaction automatically. Most people misunderstand discipline completely. They think discipline is punishment. It isn't. Discipline is nervous system training. You are teaching your mind. We do not collapse every time discomfort appears. That changes everything. Because eventually discomfort loses some of its authority over you. And once discomfort stops controlling you, manipulation weakens too. This is why emotionally reactive people are easier to influence politically, socially, commercially, and relationally. Reaction bypasses awareness. A reactive person can be guided through fear, outrage, insecurity, lust, tribalism, or validation almost instantly. But conscious people interrupt emotional manipulation faster. They observe before reacting. That observation creates psychological distance. And psychological distance creates freedom. This is why solitude becomes transformative when approached correctly. Not isolation fueled by bitterness. Conscious solitude. The kind where you stop performing long enough to observe yourself honestly. Most people avoid this because performance became survival. Always entertaining. Always consuming. Always talking. Always scrolling. Always proving. Never listening internally. But eventually life forces stillness onto everyone. Failure does it. Loss does it. Heartbreak does it. Aging does it. Isolation does it. And in those moments people finally meet themselves without distraction. Some collapse there. Others awaken there. The difference usually depends on whether the person is willing to observe honestly without immediately escaping again. Because reality becomes clearer in silence. You notice your compulsions more. Your emotional triggers. Your dependency patterns. Your insecurities. Your avoidance mechanisms. You notice how often your mind seeks stimulation automatically whenever uncomfortable emotions begin surfacing. That awareness can feel brutal initially. But it's also liberating. Because what becomes conscious becomes changeable. Not immediately, but progressively. That's why awareness is more important than motivation. Motivation fluctuates emotionally. Awareness exposes truth consistently. And truth eventually changes behavior when observed long enough without denial. This is where many people become uncomfortable with genuine self-development. Because real growth strips illusions away. You start realizing some friendships were built entirely around mutual distraction. Some habits existed only to numb insecurity. Some goals were attempts to earn worth externally. Some desires were conditioned by culture rather than authentic values. That realization creates grief. Not because you're losing pleasure. Because you're losing false identity attachments. And identity death feels psychologically painful. Even when necessary. Especially when necessary. There's a reason many people return to old versions of themselves after trying to change. The old identity may have been destructive, but it was familiar. Familiarity creates emotional safety. This is why transformation often requires tolerating temporary emotional instability. You are teaching your nervous system to survive without the old anesthesia. Without the constant validation. Without the overstimulation. Without the emotional escape routes. And during that process, your mind panics sometimes. It tells you, this feels empty. This isn't working. You were happier before. Just return to what's familiar. But what's familiar is not always what's healthy. That's one of the hardest truths adults learn. A person can feel emotionally attached to the very thing destroying them. You see this everywhere. People attached to toxic relationships. Attached to destructive routines. Attached to emotional chaos. Attached to self-sabotage. Attached to victim identity. Attached to endless distraction. Not because these things bring peace. Because they bring predictability. And the brain often values predictability more than fulfillment. That's why freedom initially feels disorienting. A sovereign mind must learn how to exist without depending on constant emotional crutches. That takes time, real time, not motivational speeches, not temporary dopamine, not one powerful video, daily reconstruction, quiet reconstruction, and most of that reconstruction happens privately where nobody applauds you. The moment you close the app instead of feeding the urge. The moment you remain present with discomfort instead of escaping it. The moment you stop seeking external validation automatically. The moment you sit in silence without needing stimulation immediately. Those moments look small externally. Internally they are identity revolutions. Because every time you interrupt unconscious behavior, you weaken the authority of the old self. And eventually the old identity starts starving. That's when something strange happens. Your perception sharpens. You start seeing manipulation more clearly. You notice how aggressively society pushes overstimulation. You notice how many conversations revolve around distraction. You notice how emotionally dependent people become on attention, pleasure, outrage, and approval. You stop envying certain lifestyles because you recognize the hidden desperation underneath them. The constant partying, the endless posting, the compulsive attention seeking, the performative confidence. Sometimes confidence is real, sometimes it's emotional anesthesia wearing expensive clothing. And the people most addicted to external validation often look the most confident publicly. That realization changes how you view human behavior forever. You stop being hypnotized by appearances so easily. Because now you understand a deeper truth. A person controlled internally will eventually reveal it externally. Always. Maybe through impulsiveness. Maybe through emotional instability. Maybe through desperation. Maybe through ego. Maybe through dependency. Maybe through inability to tolerate silence. Control leaks eventually. That's why true power looks quieter than people expect. A sovereign person does not constantly need to prove themselves. They are less reactive, less emotionally fragile, less attention hungry, less dependent on external approval for internal stability. That calmness intimidates people sometimes. Because emotionally dependent individuals unconsciously feel unsettled around someone who cannot be easily manipulated through praise, fear, lust, or validation. And this is where the deeper transformation begins fully. Not when you become perfect. When you stop negotiating your identity around temporary emotional states. That changes everything. Because now discomfort no longer defines you automatically. Urges no longer define you automatically. Emotions no longer define you automatically. You experience them without becoming enslaved by them. And most people never reach this stage because they never stay conscious long enough during discomfort. They escape too quickly. Back to scrolling. Back to substances. Back to noise. Back to stimulation. Back to validation. Back to performance. Anything to avoid sitting with the raw truth underneath. But eventually every person faces the same question whether they realize it or not. Who am I when there is nothing left to distract me from myself? And how you answer that question determines the quality of your entire future. At some point, every person discovers the terrifying difference between being distracted and being at peace. Most never recover from that realization. Because once you experience genuine internal stillness for the first time, you begin noticing how much of modern life is built to prevent it. The constant noise, the endless stimulation, the compulsive consumption, the emotional dependency disguised as entertainment. You start realizing most people are not living consciously. They are self-soothing continuously. And there's a painful reason for that. A quiet mind forces confrontation. Not with the world first. With yourself. With the insecurities hidden beneath ambition. With the loneliness hidden beneath pleasure. With the fear hidden beneath ego. With the exhaustion hidden beneath constant stimulation. That confrontation changes people permanently if they stay present long enough. But most don't. Because the moment reality becomes emotionally uncomfortable, the old identity starts whispering again. Escape. Distract yourself. You've done enough. One more time. You can restart tomorrow. The voice sounds familiar because it spent years protecting the old version of you. And that's what makes transformation emotionally violent in ways nobody explains properly. You are not merely removing habits. You are dismantling emotional survival systems that once kept you functioning. That's why the process feels destabilizing. Part of your mind interprets change as danger. Especially if your identity was built around coping rather than consciousness. This is why some people become deeply uncomfortable after even a few days without stimulation. Suddenly emotions rise to the surface. Memories return. Regret appears. Restlessness increases. The nervous system starts demanding the old anesthesia back. And in that moment, most people unknowingly make the decision that shapes the rest of their life. They either return to unconsciousness, or they remain present long enough for the old identity to weaken. That moment matters more than motivation ever will. Because identity transformation is not built during easy days. It's built during internal negotiations nobody else sees. Late nights, silent rooms, uncomfortable emotions, moments where nobody would know if you relapsed except you. That's where sovereignty is built. Privately. And the frightening part is this. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding those moments. They stay overstimulated intentionally. Always consuming. Always distracted. Always emotionally occupied. Because if they ever became truly still, they might realize how much of their life has been reactive instead of intentional. That realization can break people emotionally, or awaken them completely. You can already see the difference between these two kinds of people. One group constantly needs escape. The other group learned how to remain conscious inside discomfort. One group reacts automatically. The other observes before acting. One group is emotionally programmable. The other has begun reclaiming authority over their own mind. And the gap between these two groups keeps growing every year. Because modern culture rewards impulsiveness now. Fast pleasure, fast outrage, fast stimulation, fast validation. Patience looks weak to addicted minds. Stillness looks boring to overstimulated minds. Discipline looks oppressive to emotionally dependent minds. But beneath all the noise sits a truth most people eventually discover too late. Anything you cannot sit without has power over you. Think about that carefully. If you cannot sit quietly without reaching for your phone, if you cannot tolerate loneliness without needing validation, if you cannot face stress without escaping into pleasure, if you cannot experience boredom without compulsive stimulation, then dependency still exists internally. And dependency always extracts payment eventually. Sometimes through anxiety, sometimes through emotional instability, sometimes through lost focus, sometimes through wasted years. Because addictions do not only consume substances, they consume attention, time, identity, presence, potential, slowly, quietly, until a person wakes up one day realizing they no longer recognize themselves beneath all the coping mechanisms they built. That's why awareness becomes painful before it becomes liberating. You start seeing how many of your behaviors were automatic, how many desires were conditioned, how many emotional reactions were inherited patterns instead of conscious choices. And eventually a deeper question appears. If I stop escaping, what kind of person could I actually become? That question changes everything, because now the focus shifts away from suppression. You are no longer trying to quit behavior mechanically. You are rebuilding identity intentionally. That's the real process, not fighting urges forever. Becoming someone who no longer emotionally requires those urges for survival. That transformation changes your entire presence. You become less desperate, less reactive, less emotionally fragile, less dependent on external approval. You stop chasing stimulation every moment. You stop needing attention constantly. You stop collapsing under temporary discomfort. And people notice, not because you announce it. Because internal stability changes body language, changes speech, changes energy, changes decisions. Calmness becomes visible. That's why emotionally disciplined people often appear powerful without trying to appear powerful. Their nervous system is no longer leaking desperation constantly. And desperation leaks more than people realize. You can hear it in the person who cannot stop talking. See it in the person addicted to attention online. Feel it in relationships built entirely around emotional dependency. Notice it in people who constantly need distraction just to avoid themselves. Modern society normalized desperation so aggressively that genuine inner stability now looks unusual. Rare even. A person capable of sitting alone peacefully without compulsive stimulation has become rare. A person capable of feeling emotion without immediately escaping it has become rare. A person capable of existing without constant external validation has become rare. And rarity creates value. That's why rebuilding yourself matters far beyond addiction alone. You are reclaiming authority over your own consciousness. That affects everything. Relationships improve because dependency weakens. Focus improves because attention stabilizes. Confidence improves because self-respect increases. Emotional resilience improves because discomfort no longer terrifies you automatically. You become harder to manipulate because your mind no longer panics every time discomfort appears. And that is real power. Not dominance over others, governance over yourself. Most people never reach it because they spend their entire life chasing emotional relief instead of emotional understanding. Every urge immediately obeyed, every discomfort immediately escaped, every insecurity immediately numbed. But numbed pain does not disappear. It waits, and eventually it shapes identity from underneath consciousness. That's why unresolved people repeat patterns endlessly. Different years, same mind, different relationships, same emotional reactions, different environments, same inner chaos, because the external world changes nothing if identity remains untouched. And this is the part many people resist hearing. Your future is heavily determined by what you repeatedly return to during discomfort. That is your real master. Not your goals, not your words, not your intentions. Your refuge reveals your ruler. Some people return to awareness. Others return to distraction. Some return to discipline. Others return to impulse. Repeatedly, until the repetition becomes identity. That's why tiny decisions matter more than dramatic declarations. Every moment of consciousness strengthens a different version of you. Every interrupted impulse weakens an old pattern. Every act of restraint teaches your nervous system that survival is possible without escape. And eventually the old identity loses emotional authority completely. Not overnight, gradually, quietly, until one day you notice something strange. The thing that once controlled you no longer feels emotionally necessary. The craving appears weaker. The desperation decreases. The internal negotiation fades. Not because you forced yourself forever. Because you changed. That's the goal people misunderstand. Real transformation is not constant self-war. It's internal evolution. The old self simply stops fitting anymore. And once that happens, freedom no longer feels theoretical. It becomes embodied. You walk differently, think differently, choose differently, not because life became easier. Because you became less governable by impulse. That's why sovereign people appear calm during chaos. They already fought the most dangerous battle privately. The battle against unconscious dependency. And if this video forced you to recognize parts of yourself you've been avoiding, don't ignore that discomfort. Most people will. That's why they stay trapped. But if you've stayed here until this moment, then part of you already understands something others still refuse to face. You do not heal by endlessly fighting the addiction. You heal by becoming someone who no longer needs it to survive emotionally. If this truth reached you clearly, like the video. Comment. I refuse unconsciousness. Share this with someone silently losing themselves to distraction, stimulation, or dependency. And subscribe if you are building a mind that refuses manipulation, emotional slavery, and unconscious living. Because this channel is not for people chasing temporary motivation. It's for people rebuilding sovereignty from the inside out. Now sit with this quietly tonight. No distractions, no noise, no stimulation, just you. And the question most people spend their entire life avoiding. Who are you, when there is nothing left to escape into?